The title of this lesson is Teaching Diction, Ways to Help Writers Choose the Right Word. There are 3 learning goals for this lesson. Students will be able to define what diction and word choice are. Students will be able to apply the knowledge learned from the lesson by completing the exercise, and students will be able to analyze 2 sentences using the information about embodied simulation from the lesson. Merriam-Webster defines diction as the choice of words, especially with regard to correctness, clearness, or effectiveness. Diction is how and why words are chosen. Stephen Wilbers, in his book Keys to Great Writing, said, "Without good words, you're like a flashlight without good batteries." Author Mary Cole, who wrote Irresistible Kidlet, said, "Never forget, novels are written one word at a time, and every word is a choice." In this lesson, we will discuss choosing appropriate language and word precision. I'll also share an article about research that's being done that shows our understanding of words is connected to our sensory modalities, and we'll try to use this technique in our exercise. When choosing the appropriate language for a piece of writing, your students need to know who their audience is. How old are they? What is their level of knowledge on your subject? Are they middle schoolers? Are they college students? Are they retirees? Each of these groups has a specific set of words and vocabulary that they're familiar with. Another topic under appropriate language is slang. Slang is the use of words that are specific to a particular subgroup of people. In professional writing, students should avoid using it because not everyone understands it. And it's suggested to not use it in most academic writing. But one area where slang is actually helpful in writing is in dialogue and historical fiction. And the author in this short clip that I'm going to show discusses how studying slang of a particular people group has helped her in her writing.
That's a great question. I often, again, with my journalistic background, you didn't have a whole lot of leeway when you're quoting people. You're quoting them exactly how they've said something, and so if they have some slang or if they say "I'm gonna" rather than "going to," and you quote them directly. When you're making up dialogue, you kind of tap into that conversations that you've had in the past, so that that people do say "I'm gonna do this" rather than "I'm going to go to the store now." With my particular novel, because it was written, the time period that it was written in was about 150 years ago, people tended to speak more formally in those days. And so you can kind of fall into a trap where if you write too formally, then readers today can't relate to it, and it becomes stifling. So you want to try to find that balance. One thing that I found very interesting for my historical fiction novel that I was working on, there was a project that was done by the federal government in the early 1900s where they interviewed a bunch of former slaves who had been emancipated after the Civil War. And these were people who were getting on in years, and they wanted to kind of preserve that history. So they recorded them on, tape recordings. And then they released those recordings like in the 70s or so, remastered it, and I actually bought the collection of those interviews and tapes. So I listened to their stories and I listened to their pattern of talking, and that really helped me a lot to create the dialogue within my book, because there was a certain pattern to even how slaves talked, whether they were in the deep South versus sort of the northern South, like in Maryland and places like that, to how they talked and the slang that they used. And it is important. You want to be able to weave a little bit of that in there so that it's believable to the reader, but you don't want to put in so much that it's heavy and that people don't understand what they're reading or what the person's trying to say. So you've got to kind of find that balance. And I think just tapping into actual recordings of people talking from a certain region, and if you're fortunate enough, like I was, to have that from that particular time period, it was just a valuable tool to help me draft that.
So there's one way that slang can actually be helpful in your writing. In her article, 5 Key Ways to Choose the Right Word, Alicia Raid said, "Tone transforms because you focus on how your choices will emotionally affect your reader. Your students should avoid language that creates distance from their reader. What we write should be able to be experienced. It needs to make a definite impression on whoever's reading it." Precision is another important choice when understanding diction. Writers must appeal to the 5 senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. This goes hand in hand with trying to reach your audience emotionally. We need to use strong action verbs and specific nouns in our writing. Which sounds stronger? We had a collision, or we collided. We collided is more definite, and it paints a clearer picture in our minds. Similarly, students should choose to use the concrete over the abstract whenever possible. For example, instead of saying, I was affected by this, you could say, I was relieved by this, or I was devastated by this. The last two describe a little more clearly how the person was feeling. Repetitive words can also be an issue with your students. Suggest using Control Find to see how often they use specific words. Now that we've covered what diction is, how to choose appropriate language, and how to be precise, let's look at some suggestions you can give to your students that can help them with their word choices. The first is to read your writing out loud or into a tape recorder. If you can hear yourself reading a piece of your writing, you can hear mistakes or places that you might need to change. The second suggestion is to keep a notepad with you to write down any interesting or new words that you come across. The third suggestion is to mark or highlight phrases and come back to them later. Remind your students that they should never settle for a word if it's not fitting what they're trying to say. And sometimes all they need is a little time away. The fourth suggestion deals with an article that I read by Hannah Rule called Sensing the Sentence, an Embodied Simulation Approach to Rhetorical Grammar. Embodied simulation is defined as the experiential processes of understanding language through visual, spatial, motor, affective, and other sensory modalities. Using MRIs and a number of other tests, much simulation research shows that parts of the brain responsible for motor coordination also become engaged when action-oriented sentences are read. For example, when someone uses the words kick or grasp or bite in a sentence, the part of the brain responsible for those movements become engaged. You might already be familiar with some experiences of simulation. Using your imagination while reading an exciting novel, or giving directions to someplace familiar and moving your hands or head when trying to explain it. An example of using this in a classroom would be a professor giving feedback to her student. So let's say the student writes a sentence and it says about her life and how she decided to join the military. So the professor explains to her that when she hears that sentence, she pictures a girl marching in uniform surrounded by all of her other flight members. The student then reads her second sentence, and it's about how her life back home led her to her decision to join the Air Force. Well, then the professor goes on to explain, well, I go to that sentence, and I go over to this part of the room, and I see a girl sitting on her front porch, deep in thought. And she explains to her student that when writing, that second sentence needs to connect any following sentences to the picture in the first sentence. So she said perhaps a better way to write it would be writing her first sentence about how she joined the Air Force, and then sticking a sentence in between saying, while marching at basic training, she was deep in thought about her decision to join the Air Force. Then she could go on to say her second sentence about what happened at home that led her to make that decision. Research suggests that we do not really choose to link imagery and word. Rather, this link is the precise way in which meaning becomes possible at all. Simulation also helps writers judge the effects of their own writing. They can ask if they're helping the reader really see and experience the world that their words create. So I have an exercise I handed out at the beginning of class. There are two sentences on this page. The first sentence says, students today use a lot of technology like cell phones, Facebook, laptops, and more. When I think of that, I see a classroom full of students on their devices typing away. The second sentence says, textbooks have been an important part of school for a very long time. When I think of that, I think of another part, another classroom, dusty, and students reading old textbooks and having slates that they're drawing with chalk on. So a better second sentence to have to connect those two. Anybody have any suggestions on that? Yes, that would be a great example. So after that first sentence, students today use a lot of technology like cell phones, Facebook, laptops, and more. You could say, around all this technology, textbooks can seem out of place. And then include the sentence, textbooks have been an important part of school for a very long time. In conclusion, diction or word choice is important in all aspects of our writing. We need to choose appropriate language by knowing our audience and using slang when appropriate. We need to be precise with our word choices. And we need to help our students by providing them suggestions for finding the right word. Research is also showing us that understanding language is directly connected to our sensory modalities. And using the technique of connecting our sentences would be beneficial to the students in our classrooms.